Stop using sand and water to build your walls. In 1383, the conqueror Tamerlane found a much darker ingredient, one that didn't just hold the structure together, but actually breathed inside of it. Imagine the city of Sabzawar. The rebellion has failed, and 2,000 men are standing in chains, waiting for the sword. But Tamerlane wasn't a typical executioner. He was an architect of terror. He didn't want a graveyard. He wanted a monument. He ordered his engineers to stand the prisoners upright, layer by layer, and pour wet mortar directly over their living bodies. They weren't dead when the bricks went up. They were encased alive. As the sun beat down on the desert, the mortar hardened around their chests, making every breath a battle against the stone. For weeks, travelers reported a haunting sound coming from the fortress-below, rhythmic moaning that vibrated through the very foundation of the building. Most buildings are designed for comfort. Tamerlane's minaret of flesh was designed for resonance. He created a structure that did unjust stand in silence. It echoed with the final heartbeats of his enemies. Tamerlane was obsessed with psychological dominance. He realized that a pile of bodies is eventually buried and forgotten, but a building that cries stays in the mind forever. He meticulously timed the drying process of the cement so the prisoners would remain alive for as long as possible. Their gasps for air amplified by the hollow cavities in the brickwork. This created a terrifying acoustic effect. The wind blowing through the gaps in the stone would catch the groans of the dying men, turning the entire tower into a massive, haunting instrument of war. It was a frequency of pure agony that could be heard for miles, breaking the spirit of any army before they even saw his blade. He wasn't just a killer, he was a master of fear marketing. But how did this human concrete compare to the ancient pyramids? The numbers will haunt you. We admire the Egyptians for their stone pyramids, but Tamerlane built pyramids that were far more biological. He didn't use stone from a quarry. He used the heads of 70,000 victims in a single afternoon. From the gates of Delhi to the streets of Isfahan, Tamerlane's trail was marked by geometric genocide. In Persia, when a city resisted, he didn't just burn it down. He demanded a head tax. Every soldier was ordered to bring him at least to human heads or face execution themselves. They weren't just piles, they were carefully engineered towers. But even the skull pyramids were nothing compared to what he did in Sabzawar. There, he evolved his methods. He stopped using just the heads and started using the entire human frame as structural reinforcement. He used human limbs as the rebar, mixing flesh and bone with mortar to create a living concrete that defied the laws of mercy. It was the ultimate body horror construction. But what was the actual chemical process that made these walls so strong? There is a reason Tamerlane used hot lime in his human walls. It wasn't just for the smell, it was for the chemical reaction that turned a living man into a permanent piece of rock. In the siege of 1383, 2,000 prisoners were forced into a massive trench. They were stood upright, shoulder to shoulder, essentially becoming the formwork for the wall. Engineers then began the layering process. Bricks were stacked around their waists, then their chests, and then the gaps were filled with a mixture of mud and unslaked lime. When unslaked lime touches moisture, like human sweat or breath, triggers an exothermic reaction. It begins to boil. The prisoners were literally being cooked alive inside the stone, while the weight of the bricks above them slowly crushed their rib cages. By the time the wall was finished, the The lime had fused their skin directly to the masonry. They didn't just die in the wall, they became the wall. And modern forensic science suggests this actually made the structure stronger. Modern engineers use steel to reinforce concrete. Tamerlane used human lungs, and according to chemical analysis, his method was terrifyingly efficient. Tamerlane's human walls weren't just chaotic piles of bodies. They were technically sophisticated structures. By encasing men alive, he utilized the moisture from their metabolism to slow down the carbonation of the mortar. In masonry, a slower drying process often leads to a stronger, more durable bond. As the victims exhaled their final breaths into the wet mud, the carbon dioxide they produced actually altered the chemistry of the lime, creating a dense biological composite. The result was a wall that was nearly impossible to tear down. He wasn't just a killer. He was a pioneer of biomimicry, used for the most evil purpose imaginable. He had built a wall that could withstand time, but he didn't build it for strength. He built it as a billboard. If you were a merchant on the Silk Road in 1390, you didn't look for road signs. You looked for the finger walls, towers made of stone, where human hands still reached out from the bricks. Tamerlane knew that information traveled slowly in the 14th century. To control an empire, you needed a message that didn't need a translator. He placed his human walls at the intersections of the world's most important trade routes. He wanted every diplomat and spy from Europe to China to see exactly what happened to those who questioned his rule. Imagine the psychological impact. You're riding your horse through the desert, and you pass a fortress where you can still see the eyes of the rebels staring at you through the mortar. It was the ultimate no-fly zone. One glance at these walls was enough to prevent rebellions for 1,000 miles in every direction. It was peace through absolute horror, but there was a specific, crushing way he layered these human bricks to ensure they suffered. Most tyrants put their enemies in a cage of cold, hard iron. But Tamerlane, he put you in a cage made of your own comrades. He designed what was essentially a human sandwich, using gravity itself as his executioner. When Tamerlane built his infamous towers, he didn't just toss people inside. He used a chilling technique called layering. First, a row of living men was laid at the bottom. Then came a layer of heavy bricks and wet mortar. On top of that, another row of living men. He would repeat this process, stacking layer upon layer, until the tower reached for the sky. Just think about the physics of that for a moment. If you were unlucky enough to be on the bottom layer, you weren't just being encased in stone. You were being slowly, agonizingly crushed by the immense weight of hundreds of other human beings stacked right on top of you. It was a gradual, horrifying compression that could take days to finally stop your heart. Zero wasted space, zero wasted mercy. Tamerlane died centuries ago, but his dark legacy left a shadow so long, even the Soviet Union was terrified of it. The man who built walls out of people left a warning on his tomb that changed the course of World War II, a curse that even Joseph Stalin didn't believe until it was too late. In June 1941, Soviet archaeologists were sent by Stalin to open Tamerlane's tomb in Samarkand. Local elders warned them, "Whosoever opens this shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." The scientists laughed and broke the seal on June 20th. Inside, they found the skeleton of the architect of terror. Exactly 2 days later, on June 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Stalin was so terrified by the coincidence that he ordered Tamerlane to be reburied with full honors. Shortly after, the tide of the war turned. Was it a coincidence, or did the king of the living walls still hold power from the grave? The curse was real enough for Stalin, but to understand the curse, you have to understand the mind that created the walls in the first place. Can you be a genius and a monster at the exact same moment? Tamerlane was a polyglot, a chess master, and an art lover who built walls of human meat. Tamerlane wasn't a mindless barbarian. He was a highly educated strategist. He loved poetry and fine architecture, but he viewed the world with a cold logic. To him, a human life wasn't sacred. It was just another resource. If a rebellion happened, he did unsee people to be punished. He saw excess material for his construction projects. This is the most terrifying part of his story. He wasn't insane. He was perfectly rational. He calculated that the cost of building a wall out of 2,000 men was cheaper and more effective than maintaining a prison for them. This efficiency of evil is what separates Tamerlane from every other tyrant in history. His walls eventually crumbled into dust, but the echo of those 2,000 heartbeats still rings through history today. The sun sets over a wall that shouldn't exist. Inside the stone, the final heartbeat of a rebellion stopped 600 years ago, but the lesson is still alive. We tell these stories of Tamerlane and his breathing walls not to celebrate the monster, but to remember the victims encased in the silence of time. History is a warning that human cruelty is only limited by our imagination. Those 2,000 men in Sabzawar weren't just bricks. They were a reminder of what happens when power loses its soul. If you want to uncover more dark history that the textbooks are too afraid to mention, follow Masar. We reclaim the truth from the shadows. Which story should we build next? Let me know in the comments.